So while we're waiting for Senator Armbruster to come on up, let me just, I have two pieces of show and tell today. Show and tell. I have a slight show and tell. First is my doctoral dissertation from the Department of Geography here at Texas State. Defended this document here, February 2000. And so you can see the flags on it having to do with questions I have for all of you. No, I'm not going to do that. But I just want to see
Now you're
if,
asking?
Yeah. I just want to see if I can make sure you're awake. And the second item, now some of you know about this. Some of you may have a copy of it, but I think you might find this interesting. Judge Bunton's memoirs, which he printed himself, with a Bunton-esque title, A Little Bit of Bunton, in which he did talk about both of the lawsuits, the Sierra Club versus Babbitt lawsuit and Sierra Club versus San Antonio lawsuit, and had some interesting comments in there. But I wanted to make sure I brought this today because a few people knew that he wrote his own memoirs and had printed them up, and somehow I got a copy, a coveted copy. So let me go ahead and start introducing everybody. On the left side here, we have Russ Johnson, who was an attorney for the San Antonio water system during Sierra Club versus Babbitt. And then next to him, strategically placed, Stuart Henry, who was the attorney for the Sierra Club. And then right next to Stuart is Charles Shockey, who was the attorney for the Justice Department. And then Ken Kramer, who was the head of the Texas chapter of the Sierra Club. And then Senator Ken Armbruster, who was the senator representing much of the Guadalupe River Basin. And then Robert Puente, who was a member of the House of Representatives at that time. And then Charles Shockey, who worked for Lieutenant Governor, not Charles Shockey, sorry, Chuck Bailey. Chuck Bailey, who worked for Lieutenant Governor Bullock and was the one who really guided the legislation through for the Lieutenant Governor. And then Bill West, who was the general manager, just starting out as the general manager for the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. And so my first question, Ken, is to you. We've had 3 water forums, and somehow you have been part of every one of them. How'd you accomplish that?
It's because I'm one of your favorite speakers, and you asked me.
That is the answer to the question. You nailed it. We heard the first panel. The state tries to bring regulation to the Edwards Aquifer, and there's not a resolution there, and then you decide that it's time for the Sierra Club to file the Endangered Species Act suit. And so why did you file it in 1991?
The short answer is because Stuart Henry told us it was time to file the lawsuit. I think the long answer, not too long, is something you touched on, and something was touched on this morning. There was a lot of work going on to try to come up with a consensus solution, or at least a solution that would pass muster with a great many of the interest groups involved in the Edwards dispute. And really, it had not come to fruition. We actually filed notice of intent to sue in 1990 in the spring of that year, after being approached initially by GBRA about joining in this effort. I think it's fair to say, and Stuart can contradict me if he thinks I'm wrong, that we were not chomping at the bit to go to court. I mean, maybe Stuart was because he's an attorney, but I know that the Sierra Club leadership, including myself as the professional leader and the volunteer leadership, would just assume that this very controversial issue have been decided in some consensus form by the various parties involved without our having to go to court, because as I may discuss a little bit later, we were not the most popular people in town once we brought the initial litigation, certainly not the later litigation. I remember a public opinion poll that was done in San Antonio in 1994, a little bit after the first litigation, and I don't remember exactly who had commissioned the public opinion poll. It was kept, the results were kept private. They were not publicly unveiled. But at that time, the Sierra Club, because of all of our litigation, had a favorable rating among the citizens of San Antonio of 15%, roughly equivalent to the rating of the U.S. Congress today because of their action or inactions. So I think the basic point is that we actually filed the suit in 1991 in May, toward the end of that legislative session, because it's pretty clear that there was not going to be a resolution of the conflict, or highly unlikely, without our at least bringing some pressure on the whole effort through the filing of the lawsuit, and that it might, as I think we're pointed out in hindsight, it really required a hammer of some type to bring this to resolution. So the timing was right in that regard.
But at the same time, you had an enormous amount of rain in 91 and 92. 92 is the record recharge year, and the aquifer hits the record level. And so were you worried a little bit about, it's kind of this is strange timing here. We're filing a lawsuit on the Endangered Species Act, protect Comal and San Marcos Springs, but, they're hitting these really high levels. Is that one time you might have wished that maybe it wasn't raining so much?
Well, actually, no. It may not seem apparent to people, but environmentalists actually are very logical people. And logic would tell you that it's actually easier in some respects to solve a problem when you're not right at the crisis point. Yes, crisis tends to help drive action or force action, but you have a lot more freedom, a lot more flexibility to come up with a solution when you're not faced with an immediate crisis. And so I think that was not necessarily a consideration.
So, Russ, now you're getting ready for the trial, and you go out to Midland and you run into the Rocket Docket. And so how did things change from when you showed up compared to what you had planned for?
Wow. Well, first of all, I want to comment on the timing of the lawsuit and the lawsuit itself, because Stuart will confess, I hope, that the plan had been to file that lawsuit in the summer of 1990, which was very dry. In fact, I could be wrong, but you had a petition prepared and ready to go in July, and over the weekend before it was to be filed, we had about a 12-inch rain over the recharge zone, and the lawsuit wasn't filed in the summer of 1990. The timing was coincidental in the sense that the lawsuit was filed days after the citizens of San Antonio had voted to reject the Applewhite Reservoir, which I might add was vigorously opposed by the Sierra Club. So we had the Sierra Club opposing our Applewhite Reservoir, and then 10 days later filing the Endangered Species Act lawsuit. And to put it in, I think, some perspective, it was mentioned earlier, but one of the unique things about this litigation was, number one, the lawsuit was not brought against the pumpers. It was brought against the Fish and Wildlife Service. And really, it was an effort to force the Fish and Wildlife Service to enforce the Endangered Species Act on the pumpers. So it was unique in that it was not a lawsuit directed specifically against the pumpers. It was a lawsuit to force the Fish and Wildlife Service to literally tell us what we had to do in order to not violate the Endangered Species Act. And here's the unique thing, I think, about the litigation, and it was alluded to earlier. In the framework of the time, the Endangered Species Act, particularly as applied to the water supply for the city of San Antonio, and certainly the farmers felt the same way, was an outrageous overreach of federal authority in terms of the property rights of the residents. So I've said this before, you had the classic confrontation between environmental protection, environmental mandates on the one hand, and property rights on the other. But what made this case unique was that the lawsuit was not about some future activity. It wasn't about some proposed dam or the closing of the Tellico Dam. It was about historic activities that predated by decades the designation of these endangered species. So really, now, having said that, Stewart and the Sierra Club picked the venue for the litigation quite well. Judge Bunton was a federal court that had never met a state problem that his federal court couldn't solve, and he was primed and ready to address what he viewed as a state problem that couldn't be solved. But in terms of the actual trial, one needs to remember that the trial date was postponed because John Hall had declared the Edwards to be an underground river and was in the process of trying to implement the state plan in May of 1992. And recognize also that San Antonio had just consolidated all of its water resource agencies into one agency again in May of 1992. So you had all these competing interests basically, and you had a city of San Antonio that literally directed me to walk out and kick butt with the Sierra Club to establish that our property rights prevailed over this federal environmental mandate. So having said that, I think, and Robert has this in front of him, we knew before the judge ruled what he was likely to do. Our effort really in that litigation was to create a record that we could take up to the Fifth Circuit and hope to overturn what we viewed as likely an inevitable decision by the district court. So hope that sets the framework.
And you thought you were going to have, what, a couple weeks for the trial or something?
Well, let me put it this way. There were over 9,000 exhibits in that trial. And if you consider the process of introducing and objecting to exhibits, the thought that that all could be done and still have a trial within a 4-day period was beyond belief, frankly. Judge Bunton handled the admission of all of those exhibits in less than an hour. So that was the first indication that we were going to be in what was going to be a light speed process to get to the conclusion.
So Stuart, the trial concludes and Sierra Club wins the lawsuit. What did the judge say? What did he do?
Well, we had initially asked the judge to have the Fish and Wildlife Service determine the spring flow amounts which would be necessary and spring flow at both San Marcos and Comal Springs. The spring flow amounts that would need to be maintained under drought of record circumstances such that the endangered species, either the endangered species or one threatened species at both Comal and San Marcos Springs would not be taken under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And let me respond also to, I don't let Russ Johnson ever say anything that I don't respond to, and he reciprocates very freely. First place, the venue was picked. If you all know, the Western District of Texas, the case could have been filed in Waco, Austin, San Antonio, Del Rio, and the rule in the federal courts were that if indeed you filed a case in a particular court within a certain federal district, I mean, it had to be filed within the Western District since that was where the venue or where the actions were occurring. But if you filed a case, excuse me, in the district, the defendant was the one person who could in fact get the venue changed. And I recall, although I think Mike doesn't, I think he'd like to forget it, but I remember a meeting we had with Mike Spear when we were about to file the suit, and I told Mike, quite frankly, that it wasn't a matter of whether he was going to get sued, he was going to get sued. And out of the courts in the Western District, which one would he prefer to have it in? And he had no opinion, and so we picked Judge Bunton's court. And I'll be quite frank with you, as you probably all know, the law is the law, but you can interpret it many different ways. And one of the reasons why I had thought that Judge Bunton would be the ideal judge was because he had the gahanas to do what the law required. I don't know how many of you know, but the Endangered Species Act is probably the most expansive federal legislation to protect the biology of this country as any piece of legislation. There's not a lot of quibbling in the statute. There are a lot of mandates in the statute, and Congress didn't do much compromising when they passed that. And so my thought was to find a judge within the Western District that had enough gahanas to do what the law required. And Judge Bunton, about a year before that case, or 2 years before that case, he had in fact entertained a case against the Justice Department for discrimination of black FBI agents. And I figured any federal judge that was willing to go up against the Justice Department, and particularly the FBI, was a requisite judge we'd need in order to enforce the Endangered Species Act. And particularly in Texas, we have federal judges, some that have a lot of gahanas and quite a few that don't. And so we basically picked Judge Bunton because we knew that he had enough courage to do what we thought the law required, and that's how it got in Judge Bunton's court. I will also stress a couple of other things that were not stressed but made a lot of difference to the Sierra Club. One was in 67 through 80, the Fish and Wildlife Service had designated 5 species in San Marcos and Comal Springs as endangered. This was way before anything got going on the Edwards Aquifer. And one of the persons that was instrumental in that, in fact, 2 of the people that were instrumental in that, were in fact witnesses for the Sierra Club in the Judge Bunton case. And one of the witnesses was a University of Texas professor, and both he and his dad had spent most of their life in Comal and San Marcos Springs looking at the endangered species. That was Clark Hubbs. And so we had no problems at all proving standing. In fact, that was challenged, and they pulled it back because they knew that was a futile effort. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got out in front of the issue and designated those species endangered. Secondly, and real important to the Sierra Club, was in '85, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had prepared a San Marcos recovery plan based, quite frankly, with the help of a lot of volunteers. And one of the statements in that recovery plan was that maintaining minimum in-stream flows in San Marcos and likewise probably in Comal Springs was important in order to implement the recovery plan. Now, this was the Fish and Wildlife's own recovery plan. It was the first for any of those species. They had not done one for Comal Springs. And I think that made a big difference And then, as you heard this morning, nobody was basically going to do anything for the lack of political will. The Sierra Club, and I will guarantee you, the Sierra Club nor GBRA wanted to file the lawsuit. We were hopeful that either the Texas Water Commission or the legislature would do something, take some initiative on regulating the Edwards. I mean, quite frankly, if you want to look at a problem that needed resolving, all you had to do is look at San Antonio and its sole source aquifer, which it was relying on, and which was going to end up hurting its growth way in the future. Excuse me? And so it was an issue looking to be resolved, and quite frankly, I've done quite a bit of litigation in my time, and I very rarely have had witnesses for the defendant that wanted the Sierra Club to win. And many witnesses that were called by the defendants in this case, particularly Fish and Wildlife and John Hall, basically told Judge Bunton they'd be delighted if he told them what to do. Because everybody was looking for a scapegoat, and there was nothing better than a federal judge in Midland, Odessa to do what they had failed to do. And that's how we basically, that's how we got, won the lawsuit in my view. There were about 50 or 60 attorneys. Most of the attorneys on all sides were preparing for what might have been a month-long hearing, not knowing that Judge Bunton was noted for the rocket docket, and we would have been lucky to get 5 days of trial, and he gave us 4. And so much of the preparation was what you might call superfluous, but lawyers get paid for that, and so you can expect it. Judge Bunton, basically, in my view, was extremely reasonable in his judgment. He did what I think any judge would have done, and that is say, well, wait a minute, guys, enough's enough. You've messed around, you've talked about how you want to do something, but you don't want to do it, and it's been about 10 to 15 years. And so he basically, and it's not uncommon at all, contrary to what Russ said, the best defendant in the United States on endangered species is Fish and Wildlife, because they want to do what you want them to do. They just don't have the money. Congress has not given them the money, nor will Congress ever give them the money to do what they know they need to do. And the Endangered Species Act is not discretionary. It is mandatory. Once a species is declared endangered and to some extent even threatened, and or critical habitats determined, Fish and Wildlife does not have any choice. And there have been a lot of suits against Fish and Wildlife in order to make them in that area a priority, just as we did in the Edwards. So there was a statute waiting to be occurred. And like I said, nobody in the club, like Ken said, wanted to file a lawsuit. We had done everything we could. We followed it. The Sierra Club followed all the Edwards Underground Water District and San Antonio's efforts to do something, as well as Medina and Uvalde County. But there was just not going to get anything done. Not only that, in '89, in 1989, 1990, And again, one other time later, the spring flows at Comal and San Marcos Springs had dropped precipitously close to, in fact, Comal Springs was down to less than 100 CFS in 89 and 90. And most of the biologists that had studied the endangered species knew there was harassment, if not harm, if not death occurring. And so we had to do something. And again, you know, there was an old joke in Judge Bunton's court that every time we'd come for a hearing, there'd be a good rainfall. It was very funny, but it wasn't getting the solution to it. As a result of that, we did the suit. Judge Bunton found in the Sierra Club's favor. And let me make one other statement about that was sort of alluded to this morning. Just like Mike Spear had said about California, there are a lot of legislators and a lot of city councilmen that don't have the political will to do what they know is in the best interest of the state or their city. That was exactly the problem we had in Texas. You know, it was real, and so what we ended up doing was basically putting Judge Bunton in the position of being a bad boy, and he didn't mind that at all. He was not afraid of many things, and one of those was not San Antonio or Russ Johnson. He was just being a common sense judge, and quite frankly, he gave the Edwards Aquifer, he gave the people a lot more opportunity than they really deserved. Because one of the things he did was he said, all right, I'm not going to do anything. Fish and Wildlife, you go out and you study and you come back with some flows. And Texas legislature, you get your butt in gear and pass a piece of legislation that will ultimately end up in regulation of the aquifer. And he set a hearing the next day after the legislature was supposed to adjourn. And anybody, my view was, anybody that says that they didn't know the legislature was going to have to do something, it just doesn't understand what was going on. Because the Texas legislature didn't much care for the Sierra Club, and they weren't afraid of us. And they didn't much care for Judge Bunton, but they were afraid of him. And he made it real clear that, and that's despite the Fifth Circuit being perhaps the most conservative circuit in the United States. So as a result of that lawsuit, you did get the legislature to do something. Now, I'll talk about it a little bit later. The other thing is they did something, but in the Sierra Club's opinion, they didn't do enough soon enough. But I'll get to that later.
So, Charlie, what, in your opinion, having defended the Fish and Wildlife Service on a number of cases, what did you think about this case? And have you kind of changed your mind about it over the years, seeing that we now have a 8CP and an incidental take permit in place?
Yeah. Well, excuse me. Let me start off first by saying Judge Bunton asked every witness 3 things at the beginning of their testimony. He said, tell me who you are, where you're from, what you do. And I will just give a little bit of background on who I am. Charlie Shockey is my name. For you French speakers, je suis Charlie. The real thing. I worked at the Department of Justice for 26 years. I'd worked at the Interior Department before that. I'd been with Justice for about 5 years when this lawsuit was filed. And it was, the short answer to your question, Todd, is it was unlike any that I had experienced, and probably unlike any I've seen ever since then. It remains at the end of my career, and I retired from the Justice Department a year and a half ago, so I have to say I'm appearing here as a private citizen, kind enough to be invited by Robert Gully to show up, but I'm not speaking for the Justice Department officially or for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so I could pretty much say whatever the hell I want at this point, I guess. The lawsuit was different because at that time, as Mike Spear said this morning, the whole process of habitat conservation plans had really not been very well developed or disseminated among Fish and Wildlife Service offices. Most of the lawsuits filed were under Section 4 of the Act, saying the Fish and Wildlife Service has failed to list a species or designate critical habitat, for which Stewart indicated there are very tight time frames. The service basically has no discretion, so in my opinion, it's sort of like shooting fish in a barrel. You file a lawsuit, you say Fish and Wildlife, you missed a deadline, judge make them do it, and so the judge would impose deadlines and the service would have to meet them. The other part of Section 4 was really highly unusual at that time, and that was the obligation to develop and implement a recovery plan. And that turned out to be one of the really key aspects of this lawsuit. The other two claims that the Sierra Club and GBRA made, and again against the Fish and Wildlife Service only, were that Fish and Wildlife had jeopardized the continued existence of the species because it had not established minimum spring flows that would protect these species. That was unusual, and as we argued in court, we thought an incorrect use of Section 7, because the jeopardy standard under the Endangered Species Act only applies to actions of federal agencies. It doesn't apply to private actors, and the only federal agency in the court was the Fish and Wildlife Service itself. So our view was we had not taken or failed to take an action that was jeopardizing the species. The judge disagreed with that. And the final ESA claim was that there had been a take, meaning harm, harassment, death, or injury of an endangered species. And the take occurred, again, he argued, because, and he concluded in his order, because the service had not done enough to tell everyone else, the actual pumpers, what they had to do to guarantee sufficient spring flow to avoid any harm to the species. Todd, your question really goes to how did we handle the case then, and what do I think about it in retrospect? At that time, and this is how the Justice Department approaches many of these cases, we raised every possible defense that we could, from thought about a standing argument, we thought about a number of other jurisdictional arguments, but ultimately our position was the service has not violated any express mandatory duty under the Act. And most of the cases, in fact, in my 26 years at the Justice Department, my title was nominally trial attorney. This was the only actual civil trial that I ever participated in. And the reason for that is because most of our cases involve, they're decided on the papers, motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment. That's how we thought this case would go and how we thought it should go. But things work a little differently in Texas, especially in the Western District and especially in the Midland-Odessa division of the Western District. Judge Bunton made it clear that this was a case that he was going to have witness testimony on, he was going to have a trial, and he would issue findings and conclusions of law. So that was, in some respects, probably a great failure on my part, the inability to persuade the judge that this case ought to be decided on the basis of cross motions for summary judgment. The trial itself, as Stewart and Russell have mentioned, went on for about 3.5 or 4 days. At the conclusion of the witnesses, the parties got up and said, Judge, how much time are we going to have for closing argument? And Bunton looked incredulous and said, "That's all I've been hearing from you guys for the last 3 days is argument." No, he said, "The Fifth Circuit may tell me in a criminal case I have to provide for argument, but there's not going to be any more argument in this case." Case submitted. And the next thing we knew, of course, was that the ruling came out about 2 months later. There are so many aspects of this case that make it, I shouldn't call it a highlight, it really probably was one of the lowlights of my career in terms of having had my position radically rejected by the court. But it was probably about the most interesting case, and certainly the one that provided the best stories, in large part because of Judge Bunton and his very unique and interesting approach. When I first got assigned to the case, I contacted the various attorneys involved, and people called me up and said, "We're thinking of intervening in the case." And Judge Bunton ultimately set an intervention hearing where he brought everyone together, and I think that was in December of 1991. But before that, I took a trip down to Austin, and I don't think I'd had any cases in Texas before. I was working in Washington, D.C. at the time at the Justice headquarters. And I came down, first I met with Doug Karoom and Jim Matthews, who were attorneys representing the farmers and the city of San Antonio. And then I walked over from that meeting. Of course, they persuaded me of the rightness of their cause and why we ought to be aligned and work together. And then I walked down the street a couple blocks and met with Stewart and with Pete Schenken, representing the Sierra Club and GBRA. And Stewart made a comment at that hearing, basically saying, "Charlie, you're new, you don't understand how things work, but in Texas, nothing ever gets done unless you have a federal judge that issues a decree and basically holds the hammer over the head, if not actually strikes the blow, to make something happen." And that proved to be a very prophetic comment in retrospect, because I think that's exactly what Judge Bunton did by issuing the order that he did and the judgment directing the Fish and Wildlife Service to establish minimum spring flows, and directing the state of Texas and the legislature to undertake a serious effort to come to grips with this problem. He at least, if not maybe led to a solution, he at least broke through the ice that got things moving in that direction. Your question again, Todd, was how do I view things in retrospect? There's a bit of tension, actually. I mean, the Justice Department's role is to represent federal agencies and officials in court when they are sued. And that's what I did for 26 years. And main objective in most of those cases is to try to preserve as much discretion as possible for the Mike Spears and Elisa Scholes and Bruce Babbitts of the world, so that they can carry out their job the way that they see fit, so that they can make the decisions on what species to list, so that they can decide when and how to issue recovery plans. We try to keep the executive branch in as much control as possible. That's somewhat in tension with the interests of our clients, at least in this area, because I think, as Stewart accurately portrayed, Mike and his staff and many in the Fish and Wildlife Service really felt that the problem at Edwards Aquifer was maybe not every year, but it was a problem that needed a resolution. And as Mike opined this morning, there was really no one that we could sit down and work with and develop a plan or develop a reasonable regime for limiting pumping in order to protect the species. But the Fish and Wildlife Service was very eager to see that kind of plan in place. And both Mike and Elisa did testify during the trial, and one of the findings that Judge Bunton made was a statement by Mike to the effect that he would essentially be delighted to have an opportunity to be able to work with the Texas legislature and with the state of Texas to try to bring out some resolution to the problem of limited spring flows. So in retrospect today, I mean, if this case were assigned to me and it came in fresh now, I mean, I would certainly look at all the possible legal defenses. But in the 20 or so years from that date until today, with the experience I've had in many other cases, I think I would look much harder at trying to sit down and see if we could negotiate a resolution before getting to court. There were some efforts made, but I think, frankly, the political climate back in 1992 was not one that really would have enabled that any meaningful kind of solution to come about. We had the farming interests, we had the city of San Antonio, we had Sierra Club environmental interests to protect the species, we had GBRA with its interest in ensuring flows in the two rivers, and we had the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we also had the interest of the Justice Department in trying to avoid bad precedent that could be used elsewhere, and to try to protect the discretion of the executive branch. So, at that time, I think it wasn't feasible to really bring about a negotiated resolution. I would certainly work a lot harder to try to do that now, and frankly, I think, the Endangered Species Act can be used as a real shield to try to bring about changes, and sometimes it does so pretty harshly, but as Mike indicated, throughout the course of the last couple decades, we've also learned it can provide an effective shield as well as a spear by providing protection for water uses in this case, or any other kind of use of federal land and water, through a habitat conservation plan. And that they're never easy to bring about. They often take years or decades of negotiation, but far better to have a solution that everybody can come together, sit around the table, bang their heads on, and agree to a plan that everyone subscribes to, rather than having an ongoing series of litigation and basically leaving the matter in the hands of federal courts, who are often predictable and don't really have time to delve into and understand all the issues. So I probably would look at it a little bit differently today if confronted with the same sets of issues. Gosh, I can just talk forever about Judge Bunton. There's one other comment I want to make sure I get in, and no discussion of the Edwards Aquifer case for me would be complete without some reference to the attorney fees issue. At the end of the trial, and there's one other point I need to make first. So Judge Bunton issued his ruling in, I think, was it like February 1st or so, of 1993. The hearing actually happened right after the election, in which President Clinton won, and when he came into office, he appointed Bruce Babbitt as the Secretary of the Interior. And elections sometimes do have consequences, and one of them in this case, I think, was Secretary Babbitt was very amenable to the idea of trying to come up with HCPs as a basis to settle lawsuits and settle controversies like this. I don't, it's been so long and my memory is quite fuzzy, I don't remember I think we actually filed a notice of appeal, but ultimately the federal government decided to withdraw its appeal, much to the consternation of the city of San Antonio and the farming interests in the case. And I don't know all the particulars of how that came about, but I suspect it was a combination of several things, one of which was an interest to try to sit down and work out a resolution. The other was the sort of order that Judge Bunton issued. Although it told the Fish and Wildlife Service it had to come up with numbers for spring flow, it didn't really have the effect of enjoining a federal agency or official from doing anything or to do anything in a way that we thought would be particularly appealing to the Court of Appeals if we were to go up on appeal. So through discussions at pretty high levels through the Interior Department and the Justice Department, we decided not to pursue that appeal, and I think that ultimately sort of cut the legs out from Russ and his clients in their ability to appeal from that initial ruling. So anyhow, things go on. A year or so later, Stewart and Pete Schenken and Roger Nivola filed their motion for attorney's fees as the prevailing party, as the judge held they were entitled to do. And the notice came in, and I can't remember if I got just a redacted copy or if they told me basically, we filed a motion for attorney's fees, but you can't see it because it contains confidential information that would reveal our litigation strategy and on and on and on. And the only way we will agree to show you, the defendant, who's supposed to respond to this motion, a copy is if you sign a protective order that the judge approves, saying you will never reveal or release any information about the attorney's fees. And I said, my response to that was somewhat incredulous.
Yeah.
And I filed a brief in which the caption of the case, for every S in there, I put a $. And it was, I would say, a little over the top in terms of sarcasm, saying this is outrageous, basically, that they want the government to pay blank millions of dollars in attorney's fees, but they won't even let us see what their basis of their claim is so that we can respond to it. And Judge Bunton took a look at that motion, and he issued what he called his Cinco de Mayo order on May 5th, 1994, and that was actually how it was captioned, in which he said, you know, it was very amusing and entertaining, but he denied the motion. So the next step was I had to go back to my superiors, my section chief, the assistant attorney general, all the way up to Attorney General Janet Reno at the time, and say, Judge Bunton requires we all sign this paper saying we will not release or reveal the contents of these attorney fees so we can actually see what they're claiming. And so I got, you know, Janet Reno and everyone else to sign off on this, and we went back, and so they gave me the full, fully unredacted version of the fee claim, which was bold, aggressive. And, you know, there was. Comprehensive, yes. There was some interest in trying to get this settled, and I made it clear to Judge Bunton the Justice Department always tries to settle fee claims. And at one point, there was some back and forth, and it looked like we weren't making much progress. And out of nowhere one day, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and he said, Mr. Shockey, this is Judge Bunton calling. Now, I was not accustomed to having federal judges call me directly, so I wasn't quite sure how to respond, but he basically said, you know, so I understand your position and this and that, but do you think you could maybe get the government to come up to $2 million? And I said, well, Judge Bunton, let me see what I can do. And I went back and talked to the powers that be, and lo and behold, we, sure enough, were somehow able to come up with $2 million. It always struck me as kind of wrong, because I never thought that Fish and Wildlife had really done anything wrong in this case. The only thing we were accused of doing was not issuing sufficient spring flow numbers for the rest of the world so they could limit their pumping. But the fees were only going to come out of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which meant the federal taxpayer, all of us, were going to fund it. So we ended up getting the fees paid, and the checks, the Treasury Department actually couldn't issue $1 million check, so they had to break it down into 3 payments of $667,000 each, or whatever it was, and those all got wire transferred. And I won't ask you what you did with your share of the money, Stuart, but it, and I don't want to carry on too long about this. So I wrote this rather sarcastic brief that I filed, got picked up on by the San Antonio Express News, and I think a gentleman by the name of Rick Casey or something like that. He was an op-ed writer. Yeah. I didn't see this article on the list that was put up here. I kept looking for it. The article, the op-ed piece started, "I don't know Charles Shockey, but I like Charles Shockey, even though he's a member of 2 of the most despised groups in America, federal bureaucrats and lawyers." And then he went on to talk about the $ brief that I had filed, which was a public document. And, you know, all well and good, and I got a chuckle out of it. And then the Texas Monthly picked it up and had an article about it. And then a paper called the Legal Times of Washington got hold of this. And they printed it on the first page. And the Legal Times of Washington's a sort of, I mean, Washington's a town of lawyers. So, you know, every Monday morning when the Legal Times would come out, it's like a gossip sheet. Everyone had run to get their copies of it. And on the front page, it said, you know, Justice Department engaged in fees, TIF, and then you open it up inside, and it's basically the same as the Texas Monthly article about this fee that Charles Shockey filed, you know, with the $ and comparing the Sierra Club and GBRA to the Menendez brothers and on and on. And unfortunately for me, at that time, this was the spring of '94, we were still awaiting a new assistant attorney general, and the first choice had been vetted and didn't make it and withdrawn, and a woman by the name of Lois Schiffer was undergoing her nomination. She was waiting to be confirmed as the assistant attorney general, which is a political position. And Lois, who apparently was born without a humorous bone in her body, Lois picks up this copy of the Legal Times and goes ballistic. And my boss came back from a meeting with her where she chewed him out and said how irresponsible this was, and this is not the way the Justice Department ought to be behaving, et cetera. And my boss was somewhat supportive of me, but basically said, Shockey, knock it off, will you please? So I didn't get fired. I managed to survive. Lois got confirmed, and GBRA and Sierra Club got their fees. But it certainly added a very interesting note, and the brief that I'd filed became so notorious or well-known throughout the Justice Department that when I retired in September 2013, they presented me a copy of the newspaper article and a copy of the brief, and I'm sure that's going to go on my gravestone when the time comes. Charlie Shockey with an ask for a $. Anyhow, that's more than you asked, but.
Thank you. Thank you. So,
May I just point out that the $2 million did not come to the Sierra Club?
okay, I'm not going to ask where it went. So we need to go ahead and start talking about the legislation. So Judge Bunton rules, and he has this statement in his ruling that must have caught the attention of the House and the Senate and everybody else. He says, the next session of the Texas legislature offers the last chance for adoption of an adequate state plan before the blunt axes of federal intervention have to be dropped. And so I guess the first question goes to you, Senator Armbruster. What did you think about that statement, and was there ever any, as far as you were concerned, was there ever much consideration to maybe calling Judge Bunton's bluff or trying to see if he would actually do it, or was there an immediate sense that no, this is something that you're going to have to take care of?
In all candor, that's the first time I've heard that statement. You know, not being an attorney, I didn't know that you had to have a letter from the Vatican before you can call a federal judge. And when the task came to me in that legislative session of '93 to try to develop policy that would ensure the adequacy of the spring flows, I gave Judge Bunton a call. I didn't know that you couldn't do that, or that wasn't protocol. And I only had one question. I said, are you expecting us to pass legislation that we have to call you once a week to see if we're on the right track, or how do you want, what is your mindset in proceeding on this? And he very succinctly said, no, whenever y'all wrap up, I'll get a copy of it, and I'll decide then. So that was the direction. That wasn't much direction there, so which was fine. I think more so how my involvement and how it all came about, going back as some of the speakers have talked about, in the watershed you had predominantly wet years over the dry like we have now. And in a couple of instances, John, how many times the Guadalupe flood, and just, you know, it was disaster relief was the issue downstream. It wasn't so much, what are we going to do about, is there enough water for the tubers, or, you know, for the Ralph the Swimming Pig, or what here at Aquarina. What was it? It was disaster relief. Well, during those events, you end up being a part of, or putting a part of, groups together in every county to talk about not so much spring flows as you are about, at that time, late 80s and early 90s, too much water coming down. So we had a network in place, I guess is what I was trying to say. So after the ruling, and knowing that the judge was giving the state an opportunity to do it, take care of this, and recognizing the fact, and sometimes it gets lost, there was a regulatory authority over the aquifer at the time, the O. Edwards Underground. Now, that's another debate for another day of whether they were effective or ineffective or what role they played. What we were looking at is just that, crafting a piece of legislation that would in fact try to answer. It's been said already in here. When you look at from the western end over here to Hayes, the eastern end of the counties that sit directly above the aquifer or soon to be directly above the aquifer, you have your various stakeholders, ag interest, industrial interest, recreational interest, environmental interest, municipal interest, that have to be a part of the negotiations to craft the legislation. What a lot of people fail to realize is that you actually have more counties, some 26 counties, that are directly impacted on the health and vitality of the aquifer that do not sit over. These are your downstream, roughly from Uvalde to west of Kingsville to east of Jackson County, Edna, Lake Texana, and all the counties in between, some 24, 5, 6 counties in there that are impacted directly, not just this. I was often asked, well, how did somebody from Victoria end up carrying this piece of legislation? Well, at the same time, I was also the senator for southern part of Hayes County, and that was one of the counties directly impacted with the ruling. About the only thing that I was made aware of when we would get into I won't say deadlocked, but we'll get enhanced discussions in the working groups. And these working groups started off, I believe, Chuck and Russ, with some 98, 99 people. Now, I won't tell you that any of them had guns, but I was pretty sure they all at least had a knife on. That's how tenuous that the negotiations were, trying to develop something that would work. And it luckily I got accused of whittling them down, wearing them out with late night hearings, but this wasn't the only thing going on in the legislature in 1993. There are a lot of other things, but Bill Sims, who did in fact represent northwestern Bexar County in his Senate district, was chair of Senate Committee on Natural Resources, and asked me would I kind of handle this, and he said, here's my concern is, he brought it to my attention that Judge Bunton had made some type of statement, but it was more forceful in that he wasn't just talking about him taking over the aquifer. He was talking about all federal funds coming to the state of Texas, whether they be education, transportation, all others that could, military, that could be in jeopardy unless we found a solution. That was probably more important to the universe of the people concerned, regardless of their particular interest in the discussions, than just worrying about the lawsuit, if you will, and the issues that were dealt with in the lawsuit. It was really, we were, what does throwing the weight of the federal government against the state? Well, that was money. It's always about money. And the vast amount of dollars that the state receives, you and I send up out of our left pocket, and we hope to get some of it back to put in our right pocket. But we're being a donor state, we don't want to jeopardize any of that. So it kind of set the tone every time that we would run into, if you will, a hurdle. All right, let's cool off a little bit, come back, let's revisit this. There were a couple of things that we were trying to do. One, the the management structure wasn't the big issue as far as the legislation or it was going. It was trying to address the level of pumping, who was responsible for the level of pumping, how are you going to measure or meter, because at the time, you know, there were very few, if any, wells that were being metered during the time. So, yeah, I can understand why Fish and Wildlife couldn't come up with some kind of a flow. They didn't know how much was going out in the first place, nor did we. We being the state, because it just, you know, you get an ag well out in Medina or Uvalde County, they didn't know how much. It's not like today, but they didn't know how much was out there. But we made a conscious effort too that no single user would necessarily would be a target, would be harmed. We were going to treat them all the same. Either they were all going to go under some type of regulatory structure or they were not. And as you recall, we had one big pumper. What was the catfish guy? The Puchek. Catfish guy's name. And, well, if we would have gone after him, we'd have gone after San Antonio. We'd have gone after Dolph Briscoe. We'd all had gone after people over in this part of the state. So we decided not to, and let's try to get something. And finally, we're able to get somewhat of a consensus on how that we would develop a regulatory structure for the Edwards and with limits. That's probably the pumping limit issue was probably about as close as we got to trying to guess what Judge Bunton would take. And it wasn't, the frustrating part was, as I've said, we didn't know how much. Yeah, we had some great hydrologists from Water Development Board, from GBRA, from even LCRA. Bill, I think you were over there at the time. Some all other water groups, knowing that we were dealing with a resource that only one entity in the history of the world, depending on your religious concept, actually knows how much water is down there. The rest of us can just guess, and we just kind of pick numbers. You know, there were some blue sky numbers in the legislation. One, I have talked to people that have called me in other parts of the state, wanting to use this 2 acre-feet per irrigated acre as a guarantee. I can guarantee you that was blue sky. I know because that was my number, and how I got to that number was talking to our friends in Uvalde and Medina County and the other irrigators and picking then the most numerous crops and asked them what they irrigated, how much, and then I looked, it was before really online was that popular as it is today, but all the data I could get for those same crops nationwide, and one was like 1.8 acre feet, one was 1.6 acre feet. I gave them 2. So that was a blue sky number. And when I've told other groups, don't use that number, because if anybody questions it, you're gonna lose in a court, because you can't, there's no science behind it. It was my science. And so with that, we were trying to put together something that, one, we could all live with. One, recognizing the fact the plaintiffs did win the lawsuit. The judge would have to be the final decision maker if it was adequate to address the plaintiff's win, and that's kind of how we went about it.
And so, Representative Puente, you were in the House, and you had sponsored legislation, I think, in a previous session on the Edwards. And, here you are, and you've got the San Antonio delegation, and they're also dealing with this judgment. What was going on over in the House?
Well, over in the House, with the understanding and recognition that all of the hard work is done in the House and then we send it over to the Senate, we knew that we had to try to get some agreements down, some ideas down. But we quickly understood that something had to happen in the sense of a push, and that push was that hammer coming down from the federal government. And we all know that if the legislature has never been accused of being visionary. We meet once every 2 years. We meet and legislate by crisis. At the time, for example, our prison system was under federal control. Our mental health system was under federal control. Our school finance system was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. So we do not solve problems, especially when there's no reason to solve them. And so you talk about bluff, you talk about anything like that, we needed to have something as serious as a federal decision, and not a federal potential takeover, but a federal decision that did come down, that did force us to do something. So that was one of the things that pushed us along the way. Another one in San Antonio situation was the city leaders of San Antonio, and the political leaders and the business leaders all pushing for some type of resolution, understanding that what they wanted was some certainty, some regulatory certainty. Whatever sacrifices needed to be made, we felt that we could make them as long as we knew what they were, and there would be some time period in which to implement those fixes. So this legislation that did pass, the 2 acre-feet per acre, as Senator Armbruster talked about, as a matter of fact, in the House, we always scratched our head as where did that number come from? And so, but we, San Antonio, other pumpers got our historical high. It was based on historical use, so it wasn't like we were not going to be able to have a growing city with that amount of water that was going to be regulated to us. So with that understanding, we set about making sure that the legislation was something that could be handled by San Antonio. So it was very important to have some growing period into it, some flexibility into it, and the 15 years was very important. We had to have a certain amount of pumping in place, but as you all know, it was going to drop down to 400, from 450,000 acre-feet to 400 acre-feet, 400,000 acre-feet in 20 years. So if you think about it, 2015, in 15 years, it's 2030. Most of us kind of realize we can solve the problem, or I'm going to be dead, or I'm going to be out of office, let somebody else handle it. So we knew that 15 years was a good time period from which to resolve these problems. So we went in recognizing that something needed to be done. We wanted certainty. There was certainty in there as far as a set number, and so we set about that. One of the things that happened out of the ordinary, though, was you mentioned, Todd, about legislation the session before. Session before was really trying to get a handle on the catfish farmer. There wasn't true Edwards legislation dealing with this particular problem, but just the total amount of water that Ronnie Puchek was using for his catfish farm. And so that legislation failed miserably. I mean, this was private property rights. As Senator Armbruster said, if you're going to pick on Ronnie Puchek, well, anybody else that pumps from the aquifer was potentially going to be picked on. So that was one of the things that we, going into the new session, we knew about. And so being the legislator from San Antonio that was sitting on natural resources, I filed the bill that was going to try to resolve this problem, but you needed some regional cooperation. So I, at different times, looked to the western counties. At the time, I think it was Pedro Nieto, to try to file something with him, or to the east, the Springs interest. Libby Linebarger represented this area at the time. And for whatever reason, I could not make agreements with Pedro Nieto and the farming community, so I filed a bill with Libby Linebarger. And that bill went its way through the system, which in my circumstance was just dead end. It just fell flat in committee. A couple of reasons. One was I had the misfortune of taking the advice of 2 individuals that I thought I should take advice from Frank Madla and Eddie Cavazos. They both told me, one told me, you need to support Jim Rudd for Speaker. Both told me, Jim Rudd for Speaker. As y'all know, Pete Laney won for Speaker, so I was not on the team to really move things along. And the city leaders back home, including Russ Johnson, all knew that, and so they were just very worried all along, very worried all along. So there came a time where I knew the bill was not going to go anywhere, and so I had to make the sacrifice of getting off the bill and not, actually, maybe not even deciding to do it. It was sort of somewhat forced on me, knowing that this bill is not going to go anywhere if I continue to push it. And so agreements were made to have the bill, essentially because the House is very, very diverse, very different from the Senate, is to just wait for the Senate. Let the Senate send the bill over to the House and try to work it on that. So y'all know, the ones that follow the legislature very well, Senate districts being much larger, representing a lot more people, a lot more interest, they can afford to be somewhat more visionary, if anything else, in their thinking, because not any one group is going to control them. In the House, you have coffee every morning with the director of the groundwater district or the president of the PTA. It's a much, much more closer organization or entity that has to relate with the people. So the bill came over from the Senate. Senator Armbruster explained why he represented, or he filed the bill, was a Senate sponsor. Although being from Victoria, a lot of interest there with the aquifer, but also representing Hays County. The one that I still cannot understand is why somebody from Mauriceville, anybody know where Mauriceville is?
Little Cypress, Maurice?
Mauriceville is this close to the Louisiana border. So Ron Lewis carried the bill in the House. He was the former chairman of Natural Resources. He also got busted because he supported Jim Rudd for Speaker, but he had enough water knowledge at the time. It was late in the session that we knew we had to have something that just helped to push the legislation through. So Ron Lewis carried it in the House. And so the bill makes its way through the session, and as I mentioned, it's already passed out of the Senate. Late May, you remember Judge Button had his order, and he gave us the date of May 31st, and the session ended, I think, right around that time. And so we're late in the session, and the bill is up for debate. And as you know, these bills take a while. There's amendments going back and forth, arguments going back and forth. And for some reason, like in the 5th hour of debate, Representative Frank Court decides to get up from San Antonio and call a point of order and kills the bill for that day. I forgot what the issue was as to why it was, and the point of order was sustained, so the bill was killed. So we had to start all over, get the bill back from the Senate, and finally we have a bill that we all can work with. And it's still in effect, and not until 2007 did we make some substantial changes to that bill.
Chuck, now you're working for Lieutenant Governor Bullock, and he asks you to handle this bill for him, and you've got all these folks negotiating, all these different interest groups, and so I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that. And also, at some point, didn't the agricultural interests were involved in negotiations, and they kind of walked out or something like that, but they still pretty much got everything that they asked for. And so I'd like to explain a little bit about that.
Well, all right, I had gone to work, I had worked for Comptroller Bullock for about 7 years, and then I'd gone back to practicing law. And, you know, I'm a former prosecutor and former DPS general counsel, and I'd done RICO cases in civil practice. I didn't know anything about water. And he came into my office and said, I got a little water issue I want you to work on. Okay. And there are 3 or 4 folks that are responsible for us having this, but it just wouldn't have happened but for those people. Russ's client, Cliff Morton from San Antonio, and it's like, I can't remember, maybe one of y'all said that the city had decided it was time to get something done, and Cliff was a fine politician and a good leader. And Governor Briscoe had the same mind. It was time to get something done. Governor Briscoe understood how the legislature worked, and he actually called my boss, Governor Bullock, and that's how Governor Bullock got involved, and asked Governor Bullock if he would help get this running. So basically, what my job was to serve as the mediator. I'd done enough litigation that I knew how to do mediation, and so we brought the groups together. We had folks, we had 3 people from Uvalde that the governor, I think, had sent. We had folks from Medina County. We had folks from Bexar County and from Hayes County and Comal County and Guadalupe County. Somebody said, how about Stuart Henry? And somebody said, no, Stuart's going to want to relitigate the whole thing, so Stuart didn't get invited. But,
Thank goodness.
but I had a promise to Stuart that I would meet with him after every deal and kind of tell him what was going on. So I've described this, I haven't talked about this in probably 10 years, but it was like negotiating in the Balkans. It was walking on eggshells every day. And Todd, you're right. At one day, we crushed too many eggshells for the folks in the West, and they just got up and left. Well, that was, they were a key group, and Governor Briscoe, of course, wanted something done that was right for the state and right for his part of the state. So we would meet we met all during the session. We met usually in Austin at our offices. One time we met in Governor Briscoe's bank room. We met, we met several different places, but we would meet about every 2 or 3 weeks. And about every 2 or 3 weeks, I would go in and tell Governor Bullock that this was a waste of time. I didn't think we could pull them all together. And then Senator Armbruster started sitting in with us. And Senator Armbruster, the good thing, I could threaten with all kinds of nuclear options, but the senator was more realistic with his threats. And he could. I remember the night that we met in conference committee with the House. It was about 10 o'clock, and we had been going since 2 o'clock. And I leaned over to the senator and I said, Senator, it's getting awful late. Everybody's getting tired and cranky. Why don't we come back tomorrow? Oh, no, we're just getting started. And we finished up about 4:30 in the morning, and we had our bill, or at least we had our bill because that was the conference committee. So the 2 acre feet, I was going to mention that. The senator had been talking about the guaranteed 2 acre feet, and we were on our way, Senator, to the conference committee. And I got a call from your friend Maurice Remkus, who is one of the folks from Uvalde, and he said, Chuck, man can't make a crop under 2 acre feet, ought not to be farming. So I told the senator, I said, it's all right with you? And he said, that's what I've been telling them. And so that's how we got the 2 acre feet. There was no scientific evidence. It's just whether or not a man could make a crop. And that was one thing Maurice could do. He could make a crop over in the West. So the legislation, again, it was one of my favorite stories about the negotiating and the mediation. Doug Miller, the state representative now, at the time was the mayor of New Braunfels. And he was negotiating on behalf of the city. And he and Russ Johnson got into it over some issue. I don't even remember what the issue was. And I looked at Doug and I said, Mr. Mayor, let's step outside a minute. And so, like a mediator, I took him outside and I said, this is probably a place where you need to give in. And Doug started crying. That's how serious, these folks were taking this so seriously. But he and his lawyer and I went out and Doug said, okay, I'll agree to it. Well, it wasn't 30 minutes later till Russ and Doug got into it again. And I said, Russ, let's you and me and Cliff step outside. And it was through clenched teeth that the city of San Antonio agreed to give New Braunfels, whatever it is they wanted. But it was like that every meeting, and we had all those interests, and the night of the mediation, Speaker Clayton was representing I think was representing Governor Briscoe. About every 30 minutes, he would come up to me and say, I got some language for you to look at. Now, this went on for 10 hours, and literally every 30 minutes. Now, Billy Clayton's a former Speaker of the House, so you have to listen to him. And he wanted some language in there about constitutional rights and takings. And I said, well, Mr. Speaker, we won't do anything that violates the Constitution. And so that's what we wrote. We said, we won't do anything to violate the Constitution. And that satisfied the Speaker. Mr. Bullock was one of these kind of folks that if there was a problem, he couldn't stand it. And you would get calls all hours of the day and night. We got to solve this problem. We got to solve that problem. We've got prisons we need to put tents up in. We've got tort reform we got to resolve. We've got taxes we've got to fix. Whatever the issue was, he could not let it lie. And the one that fell my lot that session was the water.
So, Bill, you can also tell us that the bill, Senate Bill 1477, didn't just create the Edwards Aquifer Authority. It did some other things. Can you tell us about one of those other things that you are intimately familiar with?
Well, before I get into that, Todd, the 2 acre foot per acre deal, Senator, the 2 acre feet per acre deal that the Senator came up with, well, once the fellows in the West said that was okay, then we dug up the fact that during the adjudication process in the 70s, 2 acre feet per acre was used for the allotment for rice irrigation. And so if it's good enough for that, it was good enough for this. And so that just kind of put an end to it. No, I, like everybody else, watched the Edwards fight develop. I was a kid in Fredericksburg in the 50s and drought and helped ranchers burn needles off a pear for the cattle to eat. My dad took me to Landa Park and we saw the dry Comal Springs. And then I remember the floods that broke the drought. Then I went off school and then went to work for LCRA in the water business. And so I watched that process. I watched GBRA convince John Hall that it was an underground flowing stream and that drill. And then the court throw it out. And in my opinion, at that time, the state of Texas wasn't ready to regulate groundwater. And that's why that took that turn. As a bystander, I watched Judge Bunton's court, and at LCRA, we had a federal case before Judge Bunton, millions of dollars at stake. We were fighting the UP, the railroad. Both parties rented houses, moved lawyers out there, and we ended up with a judge saying, you've got 1 day to make your case, you've got 1 day to make your case. You'll have closing arguments on the 3rd day by noon, and that afternoon I'm ruling. And he did, the rocket docket. So watching the Edwards debate in the legislature, and then come the fall of '93, I applied for the general managership. I had several endorsements in that process. Jake Pickle was talked about this morning. I was involved in the Canyonland Habitat Conservation Plan. The good senator here was helping me procure that position. We heard conversation earlier about Quail 1 and Quail 2, and he said, son, I'll support you in this deal if you won't ever build Quail 1 and Quail 2. And I said, yes, sir. So a lot of background there. I thought I understood most of the issues, but what I didn't understand was the culture in San Antonio when I took that job. And I'm not sure I still understand that culture. The board hired me to work toward the management of the Edwards and to protect the Coal Mountain San Marcos Springs, to make peace and repair relationships, especially with the legislature. Because such ill will had evolved, one of the provisions of Senate Bill 1477 sunsetted the GBRA board. And so I went to work for a sunsetted board, not an organization, but a sunsetted board. And so I had 94 and the first part of 95 to mend fences and get a local bill passed to get the GBRA board out from under sunset. And that was a busy time. On the third reading, Frank Court stood up
Don't look at me.
and said voted no. And everybody, including our representatives, voted no. And that was the third vote. And so we had 4 hours to get that vote turned around. And Senator Howard was our representative, our lobbyist at that time. And the two of us called people off the floor of the House and said, hey. And so in 4 hours, we got that vote turned around and removed the sunset of the GBRA board. You know, at LCRA, I had the privilege of being involved in some water wars that were pretty intense. Went to state Supreme Court, fights with the city of Austin, irrigators downstream. And so I thought I could make a mark and try to help solve the problem. But boy, did I underestimate the challenge at the time. You know, after 20 years of the process, you know, you've heard the name Joe Seves, Cliff Martin, and Cliff was a gentleman, he was a statesman. Joe Moore, and many others, Robert. So here we are. We've raised the cap. We've incorporated the RIP. We've established the HCP. Many chapters of the Edwards saga have gone on. But what we face now is another drought. So the test of the HCP is upon us. So the best laid plans of mice and men, here we are.
So we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask a question to the attorneys. You can't filibuster this time because we don't have time for that. So this is, I know, you're going to have to help me keep in line here. So this is going to be quick. Did Judge Bunton have the authority to do what he did?
That's easy. Yes, and he'll say no. Go ahead. Next
Okay.
question.
And what do you say?
Let me expand on that no.
Give me a break. You done lost, son. Give it up.
You know, I've never been accused of being a good loser.
No,
but,
that's right.
But let me just say.
That's why Stewart wasn't in the meetings.
Yeah,
That's
there
right.
you go. Let me just say this. Judge Bunton went out of his way to ensure that his judgment was not appealable. I mean, he went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that no other judge ever got to look at that decision. Now, that tells me volumes about his confidence in the legitimacy of the ruling. Now, having said that, I wouldn't disagree, you'll be shocked to hear this with Stewart, when I say that clearly his decision was the fulcrum, was the focal point of the solution to the problem. So I say what I'm saying with the knowledge that had he not done what he did, we probably would not have achieved the goal.
And I guess my response is, while I don't agree with the judge's ruling, and I certainly would have preferred it to come out a different way from my Department of Justice litigation perspective, I think he had the authority to do what he did. I don't think it was something beyond the scope of judicial power. I simply disagree with some of the results. But having said that, like Stewart and Russ to some degree, you know, I think it was an important development and ultimately a very constructive thing in terms of framing the issue and getting resolved, at least to the extent it has been. It wouldn't have happened if the ruling had gone the other way. I think there would have been just continued rounds of litigation
Senator Armbrust has an observation, then I got another short question for you.
Just one quick observation. You know, when you deal in water policy and issues, it's always strange how things come together. We've been talking about Judge Bunton, and this probably was, I won't say the high mark of his distinguished career as a jurist, but it certainly put him on the map as far as water issues. Judge then left office. He was replaced by Judge Janelle. Well, one of the problems that Bill talks about now that we're in this drought that we're in, that causing a little bit of problems statewide, is the rule of capture law, not rule of capture, excuse me, the interbasin transfer bill, that you go over here to the Sabine that's got 1 million, or in Toledo Bend, 1 million acre feet of surplus water, that can't move it over here to where we need it, or out to Lubbock or anywhere else. Well, the father of interbasin transfers was Rob Janelle when he was a House member. So all of a sudden, that particular court now is kind of got two. Now Rob's left the bench, so we'll see something else. He went back to, he's a ski instructor in Ruidoso.
That sounds a
Let
lot
me,
more fun than being a
let me
judge.
respond to one thing Russ said. I just can't stand him getting the last word. If you were a